August 15th, 1971. Richard Nixon closed the gold window on the world and changed the monetary order. Let's talk about what the Federal Reserve knew, what they were thinking about leading up to this incredible moment when they were going to become the center of the monetary universe, when they no longer had to look at this gold, this piece of gold, and somehow square themselves with this lumpy rock. What did the Federal Reserve know? When did they know it? What did they think about? We're going to ask Jeff Snider, who read the transcripts pre and post Nixon Shock, and we're going to learn exactly what the Federal Reserve officials were thinking. Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. Jeff, good morning. How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing
always
well.
A good day when we talk gold, right? I mean, that's always fun.
Yes. I should have something funny to say, but gold is boring and insurance, and it's there to do nothing. So that would be counter the spirit of gold for me to make some sort of funny remark or something. It's just there.
It's
does
solid.
nothing.
It's dependable. You never think about it. That's the sound money. That's what it's supposed to be. It's the thing that you don't have to think about, so that you can think about all the more productive things in your day. I mean, that's the whole point of sound money, is that because it's so sound, it's the last thing on your mind.
Did I ever tell you about the study Gold Returns?
No, I don't think you have.
It was originally in 2013 and then published in 2015, a couple of Harvard economists, and what they did is they did a survey of, I don't remember the numbers, but let's say 40 to 50 macroeconomic shocks, including wars across 24 countries or so. And they looked at cash, bonds, equity investments, and gold, and they wanted to see, well, how did these investments do during these shocks? And you know what they concluded? They concluded that gold was a poor hedge and a poor investment, because you know what gold did during those shocks? Nothing. Nothing. But that was, and I was saying, that's the point.
Yeah, they're missing the point there, right over their head, right?
Everything else, the bonds, the stocks, the cash, straight down, while gold had the same statistical return in crisis and out of crisis. And that's the point, I think.
Yeah.
So,
no, that is exactly the point. And that's really what sound money is about, is when the shit hits the fan, it's the thing you don't worry about. You worry about everything else, because you know that, no matter how bad it gets, this is the thing that will survive. And that's really, that's why the drive, the need, the desire, the longing, the romanticism over the gold standard is because that sounds like a really good world. Now, it's obviously much messier in practice, and it's not as perfect and ideal as maybe we want to make it out to be, but those are definitely the characteristics that we want to shoot for, thinking about the monetary system going forward from what we have today. You can hardly do worse than a sound money system that does nothing during crisis.
The article we're going to be discussing was posted on the 9th of August, the 14th anniversary of the malfunction of our global monetary order. And you point that out in your title. You call it The Two Big Anniversaries of August, the Lost Decade Plus of the Fiat Half Century. Now, Jeff, the blog post starts out kind of rough. I'm going to read this. As my esteemed podcast co-host, Emil Kalinowski. All right, so not a great kind of, I don't know, but it gets better from their audience.
Well, I think I said it was esteemed, SESTEAMED. So I just, you went through a steam bath or something.
The humidity here in the Cayman Islands, Jeff. Woo! But I don't have to do dry cleaning. I just walk outside. So here it is, Jeff. If the Federal Reserve was about to become the most powerful force in the economic and financial universe, its officials must have had quite a lot to say about the final breakdown of gold exchange. FOMC meeting July 27th.
Yeah, they didn't talk about it. It never came up. It's like
say that again. I don't understand.
Yeah, the meeting before August 15th was the end of July, and this is true at the end of June as well, and as well as all the other meetings in 1971. You would think that with everything going on, with this major break, that behind the scenes, the Fed must have been really busy to get ready for this new brand new world order that was going to be unleashed upon them. I mean, and yet they completely unaware, didn't talk about it. It was just business as usual at the Federal Reserve all throughout 1971. As things were falling apart pretty much everywhere. And really the Nixon administration, the Treasury Department officials at the time didn't even really involve anybody at the Fed in their negotiations and discussions and putting together what became Nixon's plan. And really beyond that, closing the gold window wasn't even at the top of the president's list. It was mostly about wage and price controls and macroeconomic factors. And oh, by the way, maybe we should do something about the last vestiges of the gold system. But yeah, I mean, the point is that what we've been told since 1971 is, okay, the Federal Reserve was finally free to be itself and to print money as it saw fit. That, becoming the center, as you said, Emil, becoming the center of the monetary universe in August 1971, that certainly was not their understanding. In fact, they weren't even informed.
July 27th, 1971, 2 weeks prior, Memorandum of Discussion. It was 86 pages of literature that you read, Jeff. Poetry. Gold was mentioned all of how many times?
Twice.
Right.
And it wasn't even about Bretton Woods. It was about, hey, what was the gold price in London? Which is, I mean, they should never have been talking about the gold price in London anyway, but that's really all they referred to is, how bad is the situation today? That's really all.
June 29th, 1971, 1 month earlier, how many times did they mention gold, the yellow metal, or what was Keynes'
barbaric relic?
Yeah, barbaric relic. How many times did barbaric relic get mentioned in that?
Well, maybe privately they talked about it a lot, but it didn't hit the actual official well, it's not really a transcript, but it didn't hit the memorandum of discussion summary. They talked
Twice.
about gold just 2 more times, right?
Yes.
And again, it was the same things. It was, what is the price of gold doing in London this month? And it's nobody was saying, this system's falling apart. It's going to be changed. We need to get ready. Bretton Woods, blah, blah, blah. None of that. It was just business as usual at the Fed.
All right. So they were surprised, Jeff. That's why it's called the Nixon Shock. Nobody saw it coming except lots of people. Except for the Fed. I think that's kind of, I guess I'm damning them. But
point here, right? I mean, we have this view of the Federal Reserve that's taken from Alan Greenspan's time there, which this is the ideal technocratic institution. They're full of competent, the best and brightest Ivy League scholars who know their stuff and they can do whatever they said they can do. That was never the case. The Federal Reserve was a joke through most of its history because it was so utterly incompetent. It was so bad at what it did. The Fed was usually an afterthought. I mean, that was obviously true in the reforms of the 1930s after the Great Depression, when everybody realized we don't really know what caused the Great Depression, but we knew you guys didn't prevent it, which is what your mandate was. So we're going to reform the Fed as an afterthought. I mean, even the 1950s and the 1960s, which is supposed to have been an ideal, almost a golden age period in economic history, the Federal Reserve was subservient to the Treasury Department, despite their claims of independence in 1951. The Treasury was the major driving force in monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. The Fed was essentially subservient to the Treasury, and that was true into the 1970s. This idea that the central banks are this major, massive force is a modern fiction. It's an invention that came about during the 80s and 90s to help sell the public on expectations policy. And once you realize that and orient your worldview to that fact, you start to look at things very differently, including what was the significance of August 15th, 1971? Well, for the Federal Reserve, it was a massive shock, but for the system itself, not really so much, because it was sort of like, well, we kind of heading in that direction anyway, so this is kind of just somebody turning the lights out after everything was over.
Well, we all make mistakes, Jeff, so they weren't on the ball. Okay, some of us make mistakes for decades, Me, for example, the 60s were like that for me. And, okay, the Federal Reserve was out to lunch for a while, but August 24th, Now it gets serious, okay? They meet again, August 24th. At the start of the meeting, Burns, you can tell everyone who Burns is, immediately asked that only the executive members and whatever few staff directly related to the discussion remain. Holy S. Now it's serious. Now they're going to talk about it. So once he cleared out the room and they were going to have an honest to goodness, apolitical discussion, what did they talk about?
The federal government deficit. It's Arthur Burns, and at the time he said let's leave the executive staff and anybody who's relevant to the discussion, because some of the details were not supposed to be widely disseminated at the time. But mostly what they were talking about, because remember, this is the monetary realm, and a lot of the belief about what was creating this inflationary great inflation, it wasn't called the great inflation yet, but what was creating or responsible for that inflationary wave was the federal government's deficits. That was the idea from the very beginning, that through combination of spending on the Great Society as well as the Vietnam War, the government needed to get its house in order, and that's the reason why they had this inflationary problem looming. And so that's what they wanted to talk about. What was the fiscal part of the Nixon shock of August 15? Because his plan that he released, that he told the public and got on TV and said to the public on August 15th, wasn't just about Bretton Woods and gold. It was about a whole bunch of other things like wages and price controls. Wages and price boards, those things. Like, what was the federal government spending? What was its projected deficits going to be for 1971 and 1972? Everyone was much more concerned about what the federal government and Treasury was doing than what the Federal Reserve was doing, and that included the Federal Reserve. They spent a lot of time talking about what was Congress' next budget going to look like. Was it a real budget? Were they committing to actual spending cuts? Were they committing to taxes? I mean, all this other discussion that had very little to do with the actual monetary system itself.
It's a very delightful story as to who headed up that price control board. Did you know that it was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld who were number one and number two deciding what sort of prices can be charged? And Jeff, I don't think people appreciate how bizarre and in-depth and involved the heavy hand of the administrative state was. I know of one example. I believe it was the University of Alabama. Which one's the leader of the football? I always mix them up. Alabama or University of Alabama. It's so embarrassing I mix this up. I don't remember. Okay, maybe it was some college in the SEC who asked if they could increase their season ticket prices. They went to Dick Cheney.
From
yes,
Dick Cheney, yeah.
Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, can we increase season ticket prices for, I think it was maybe the South Carolina Gamecocks, or maybe it was Alabama, I don't know. And the answer was no, you can't.
It's amazing. Whenever I write about it, I always say that, in August of 1971, forget Bretton Woods, that wasn't the main part. It was, Mao Zedong was jealous of what was going on in the United States, because that's really how it was. And I think it's so foreign and so far back in history, 50 years now, that it's passed from living memory. But it really sounds like it's something out of a science fiction novel, except for in our COVID era today, it actually seems like everything's coming full circle again, at least moving in that direction. But really, the government took a very heavy hand in 1971 to try to get a hold of inflation. And spoiler alert for those people out there who think that this is a good idea or what, that there's some value in this very heavy-handed top-down approach, the Great Inflation would continue for more than another decade. So it really didn't last very long. These, wages and price controls were gone within a year or a little over a year. It didn't really work out so well because that wasn't really the problem, which is, again, pretty much par for the course when you're talking about the government's interventions, because usually they start out with the wrong idea and then come up with the wrong solutions that lead nowhere but the wrong direction.
So that's what Arthur Burns was focusing on when he asked everyone except for the executives to leave. But finally, as you say,
the first thing, hey, let's start our meeting by let's figure out whether or not the federal government can fix this mess, because it's not our job. That's really essentially what they were saying.
And then, but finally he said his piece, and he sat down and he let everyone else chime in. And this is when the discussion turned to gold. True?
Yes.
What did they say then?
Well, now you have some basic, just, sort of technical issues. There's logistical issues with, we had kind of settled into this routine where we work with other central banks and governments around the world to try to jerry-rig the what was left of the Bretton Woods system to just kind of hold on to the idea that it was still somewhat functional, even though we know that it wasn't, and a lot of people around the world already knew that it wasn't. At the Federal Reserve, they thought it seems to be working. Inflation's Treasury's problem, not ours. We're still kind of managed. Yes, there's a two-tier price structure for gold, and that's really very contrary, completely outside the lines of Bretton Woods anyway. But we're still calling it Bretton Woods. It's still somewhat functional. We're cooperating. We're doing some things. As far as the Fed was concerned, why change anything?
Can I read a quote here from Mr. Coombs? Not a quote, I suppose, but just a description of what he was saying. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
In comments supplementing the written reports, Mr. Coombs observed that the decision to close the gold window had demolished with one stroke the Bretton Woods exchange rate system. But no, not really, right? It was just the signing of the death certificate.
Yeah, that was from the Fed's perspective. It was like, what are you doing? Everything we're doing, we're behaving normally. We've got everything, we seem to be functioning somewhat well, and there's no reason to take what they thought was a drastic step because, as far as the Federal Reserve was concerned, everything else that was going wrong at the time was somebody else's problem. So there was no reason to close the gold window. There was no reason to go that far because the Fed would kind of like the situation that they were in, which was they were sort of squirreled away, way in the corner in the back. Nobody really paid much attention to them, and they just kind of went about their daily business trying to swap dollars with Switzerland and Italy and everybody else every now and again.
Foreign governments and central banks were immediately confronted with the problem of how to operate their exchange markets without a convertible dollar or any alternative intervention currency. They had no choice but to close their exchange markets in the hope of reaching quick agreement in the common market and closely associated countries on a coordinated exchange market policy. As you say, no cooperation was found. And that was the early 70s, and it echoes that late 70s, 1979 piece from the New York Fed, where they wrote about the Eurodollar system and how there is no lender of last resort for the Eurodollar system, and how they complained and warned and pleaded that there's unlikely to be any international cooperation in the future, and they were right.
Yeah, and really, that's kind of what gold was. Gold wasn't really the central bank because it was a fixed money supply, but at least it was something behind all the dollars, right? I mean, that's really what they were talking about, these foreign officials and foreign exchange officials, was that, look, if things get out of control, we at least have something in the system that we can go back to and go back on and convert into to make sure that the system works as the way, there's some way in which we can depend upon, how everything is supposed to fit together. And you take that kind of away, which is what had been happening since, November 1961, the London gold pool. And even before then, a lot of these places had already started to work around the Bretton Woods system, but they still had, sort of that kind of just clinging to that last little bit of it because, human beings are emotional and irrational, everything else, and that includes officials and central bankers. But by and large, functionally, the global exchange system had already changed, and it was really about taking away that last crutch, that last little peg in the stool, and what would happen following that.
One of my favorite parts of all the research you do is finding those little nuggets where central bankers, in memorandums of discussion, in speeches, are admitting and throwing up their hands and warning and pleading for help because this monetary system is out of control. And I think the most interesting little nugget that you discovered by reading those transcripts from 1971 was what came from the July transcript. Here we go. I'm going to read it out loud, and then you tell us kind of what the important punchline of this is. Quote, Of the two items, the chairman continued, one involved a possible change in the form of the committee's directive to the desk. Which desk? You'll tell us. A number of members were dissatisfied with the present procedure of placing main emphasis on rates of growth of the monetary aggregates or on levels of the federal funds rate, and some had come to believe that the directive should emphasize member bank reserves, the one magnitude which the desk could control more or less directly.
Yeah, there's a lot in that one little quote that ties together not just August of 71, but August of 2007 and everything thereafter with QE and bank reserves. Essentially, when we got into the actual monetary business, remember, this was the July meeting, right? This was before August. So for the Fed, it was business as usual at that point. And business as usual at the Fed before August 1971 was, there's something wrong with the monetary system. We don't really know what it is, but we've been kind of pegging our monetary policy based on monetary growth is what central banks are supposed to do, right? I mean, that's Walter Bagehot going back to the 19th century, standard monetary practice. And what they kept hearing from the banking system coming back to them is, look, this isn't working. This isn't working. And then looking at inflation. Well, we hope it's Treasury's fault, but maybe it's not. We don't really know because targeting monetary aggregates, we don't really have as much control over them. And oh, by the way, we're also starting to find out that these monetary aggregates seem to be missing a whole bunch of other stuff too. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the monetary details that don't seem to be lining up with certainly monetary policy, but also big, smart, capitally economic understanding as well. And what Arthur Burns was saying is, maybe we should just do what we can do, which is target the level of bank reserves, because the level of bank reserves are the one thing that we actually control. And that's just such a stupid statement, because you're thinking we can control bank reserves, but yet there's all this other monetary stuff out there that we can't control. And maybe that's kind of important about inflationary conditions or deflationary conditions, as the case and circumstances may be.
It's a shame they don't have any economists on staff that could look into this matter. Jeff, that's it from me for this part. Are you ready to move on to part two?
Yeah, I think the last little bit here is that, August 15th of 1971 is one of those things that's misunderstood for a lot of different reasons. And it's given a level of importance and significance I don't think that's appropriate, because in going back and reviewing, I mean, look, the idea was that we went off the gold standard and that unleashed a fiat system. That wasn't true. We had been under a fiat system for a very long time before then, and an international system that had depended almost nothing upon gold to begin with. It was a Eurodollar standard that developed long before then, which explains why nobody bothered to tell the Fed that they were going to actually do this, because it wasn't really necessary to tell the Fed. Everything else was sort of kind of taking care of itself.
In part two, we're going to discuss the most recent Treasury International Capital Report, and we're going to talk about three important developments.